Now let's get into some adaptive mojos doing their gesturing. We're going to start off with Nizai Stephen Colbert in the O'Reilly interview. So Stephen, since he's parodying Bill O'Reilly, who's a directive, he's doing his gesturing, and his gesturing is directive as he's doing it. It's structured, but you'll notice that he has a Gumby claw in his gesturing, and there's a slight wobble to his gesturing. It doesn't stab as you've seen the directives do. It kind of wobbles and sort of, for him, since he's a knee mojo, it bobbles. His fingers are out. Instead of leading with the tips, he's leading with the pads of the fingers. Instead of being tip powered, they're sort of like padding something in the air that's opposite from the energy of the gesture. This is supposed to be a puncturing type gesturing, but he's doing it with sort of a patty cake sort of motion. The wobble that you see Stephen doing is part of what makes this an adaptive doing yang gesturing. When Colbert starts doing the finger pointing and he does the finger jabs with both hands and is wagging the finger at Bill O'Reilly, he's doing so with a lean back energy, and the gesturing is traveling with a high viscosity and not coming out far from the body, which makes sense because he's in a full parody mode with a full-on Zai head tilt and having a great time doing so. When doing the finger pointing gesturing, which he's doing a good amount during this interview, there's usually a forward orienting of the knuckles as you press forward. That's natural for yang gesturing. So a directive, when they point the finger, you'll notice that the knuckles are oriented forward. It's part of a power arc for tool use. Also, when you see the tool gesture, there's a power arc for pressing, for driving forward. So in the finger pointing, that finger kind of acts like the tool, and you point it forward and you drive it in. Stephen or Ademus, for example, don't do this. The knuckles are instead pointed more up, and the tip is almost being tapped downward as if tapping on a table in the air, not forward. So he's doing the pointing, but instead of aiming it forward and jabbing, it's going down like a flipper. There's a tapping on his pointing gestures, which directives wouldn't be doing during their pointing gesturing. Something that you'll see a lot as a recurring counterpoint theme is, which I've mentioned a little bit before, is when directive mojos do yin gesturing, it has a percussive quality to it. In reverse, there's a floppy quality to yang gesturing when adaptives are doing that yang gesturing. When you see Colbert doing the finger gesturing and most of the gesticulating that he does, when he's in that pumped up persona and on his show, you actually see wagging of his fingers or shaking his hands or doing the karate chop gestures that you see directives doing, often the Vaiji that he's parodying. He does a great parody of a Vaiji, and he does a lot of Vaiji gestures, and he's trying to yang them up to really accentuate the parody, but still that floppiness in the movements is there in the wrists. The wrists wiggle at the end of doing those yang gestures, and you won't see that with directive mojos. There's a very important point that has been mentioned before regarding the central axis point, and that's been with the spinal column. The chest, the hips, chest, and head, jutting and swaying are axis points, and they relate heavily to directive versus adaptive and how those axis points move and break. Here with Colbert, how he's setting his body axis is actually the sign of tower use of one of those tower powers. With tower power use, there's a sway back with the head and the upper torso, the carriage, and there's also not only with the spine, there's also an axis point with the wrist. To set up the power line or the power drive from the bone of the wrist to the hand, which can be used for anything, like if you're playing the piano, if you're doing kung fu, if you're chopping lettuce, you need to line up your forearm with your wrist with your hand. Directives naturally move their hand into that axis point over the wrist. We're talking here as if the swivel point is your wrist, and this could be like your head going forward. There's almost a jutting forward with the hand. You'll notice this with Demas, and Colbert is doing it during this interview when he holds his hands up in that finger up position, a yang position. His hand is collapsed from the axis point. It's not following that axis point. Sort of like doing a bench press, you flex to press up. A directive is naturally flexed up to do the tool using, the finger pointing, the finger jabbing. So even in a gesture that has a jabbing digit in it, the wrist of Colbert is not set to take pressure, to take load. The wrist is in a collapsed position. It's not in a jabbing and driving forward position. That's a classic, yin or adaptive Mojo doing a yang gesture, because the entire point of the gesture is to point and give clarity along with articulation. And this actually, the fact that his wrist is collapsed, it's not driving forward with the whole gesture, actually makes the pointing a little more ambivalent, which is something that all adaptives do, and it's also not as protrusive. So even though the finger is up, by collapsing the wrist, it drops the silhouette. So it's not as protrusive, the gesturing. The most protrusive angle is the tool use, or the fingertip, when pointing. Directives naturally project that energy, whether doing the finger pointing forward or up. That energy is projected and it follows that power arc, that line. For adaptives, though, there is again that collapsing, so the fingers are pointed but with a collapsed wrist. It does not follow that power arc. Alternatively, the yin gesturing for directives, it's supposed to be a floppy handed kind of thing when they're doing this, the windmills, for example. But even when directives are doing it, it tends to have a tool using disc tensioned gesture to it. And directives will have to work to release the tension. And even if they get just a little bit excited, that tension will come back into their joints, into all of their movements, because that's just natural for them. The finger pointing has the intention of sending a message to add clarity, but with adaptives and that collapsed projection, there's a reduction in articulation and clarity and a lack of setting of agenda. This is very interesting because Colbert is imitating O'Reilly, who's a Vaigi, and they tend, and Vaigi and Bill O'Reilly tend to do a lot of finger pointing to emphasize, that's how I feel about this, and this is how you should feel about this. There's a low viscosity when Vaigi in the movement, when Vaigi do this movement, and the drive is moving forward and into the group space. O'Reilly is also doing the jabbing. You see during this interview when he's talking to Colbert, or going at Colbert. And with him, his Zai is actually keeping him from jabbing Colbert in the chest with his finger. An actual directive, particularly one with Ji, which is interesting because these are all shades of me, but all Ji mojos, the ones who have it as their Ji as their first two powers, when they're jabbing, doing that jabbing gesture, if they're not Zaiing it for cultural or legal reasons, actually the gesture is designed to jab a person, like really pointedly in the chest, or, you know, into their vicinity, into their eyes, like, you listen to me now, kind of thing. Colbert, you know, also keeps collapsing not only his wrist, but his elbow also as well. So as to remove it from the group area. His gesturing, you know, he does that, but you know, the pointing and the gesturing, but it keeps wobbling into that collapsed yin positioning. When you're equally good at reading and hiding, reading wins, because you actually need them to think, to breathe. Your directive or adaptedness actually runs how you sit on a chair. You can't keep track of that. You just can't keep track of all of those factors and elements. It's just as natural as breathing. Another variation on that theme, we did the finger pointing gesturing and how that's different. There's also a gesturing with the hand collapse or the fingers collapse, like sort of that tool using gesturing, and how it looks different in adaptive and directive versions. So this is a tool use variation. So imagine you're using a tool that's held in between your thumb and your index finger in such a way that you could press it into something, you know, the way you would hold an ATM card, for example. But then there's the collapsible wrist issue. When you see a directive doing this gesturing, it's clearly a tool use or a note pointing gesture, and it has an upward tool use energy. In this case, it will go from the wrist into the bent knuckle of the index finger. When adaptives do it, it actually looks like they're a little bit like they're holding maracas. The wrist has more of a floppiness to it, and it doesn't make a power arc of strength from the forearm to the wrist, because as an adaptive, our natural way is to not modulate any more than we have to. I mean, for any mojo, it is that way. And so we're not really holding on to something. Directives will actually hold the position as if they're holding something even when they don't need to. And that's because holding a gesture like this actually aids momentum for a directive mojo. But one thing that will slip out being a parody artist is that there are actually things that are naturally not going to be energetically rewarding for Colbert. So he would actually have to think to do those things, to analyze the movements and do them that way, to think about this and to do it this way. You know, his momentum won't actually feel the need to hold these positions, hold the tension, to actually hold the power arc. So when someone's approximating someone's gesturing, you'll need to think to do that, to actually do it, because there's no innate reason to actually do the gesturings in that true way, like 100%, every single nuance and detail, because there's a tremendous amount of it. A directive such as the Vaiji that he's parodying feels strongly when he's doing the same gesturing, and when he does it, it looks very much like he's holding some sort of scripture, some sort of legal hand down of natural law, of a person, you know, that he is handing down to a person that is lesser than him and needs to listen to what I'm saying. And he's not actually parodying at that, he actually believes that, you know, and you can't fake it. All directive mojos feel good when doing that type of gesturing, and subjective directive mojos feel particularly good when doing that. And this is a good counterpoint because Colbert is O'Reilly's polar in terms of mojo. He's both adaptive and objective. So for both those reasons, there's no need for Colbert to actually do that gesturing is 100%. O'Reilly's gesturing 100%. He's not really feeling like he's holding a Vi map of superiority over this other person. He's doing his own form of superiority by being witty and making a joke of the whole affair, but O'Reilly is actually holding his worldview in his hand. That's something that hunters will do, and you know, then they hold it up for everyone to see. You know, directives jab high into the common area and into the crowd. With adaptives, even when they're waving to a crowd, they do so you know, around a halo effect. So there's an area around them that they really don't go past usually, or naturally. It doesn't come out of the personal range. Directives don't have a problem with gesturing that comes forward into the common space or upward for all to see, you know. That's why they held it up. Colbert is actually doesn't get momentum from this. He's pointing up, you know, pointing up to make a joke out of it, and it's working beautifully. But O'Reilly is holding it up to give himself personal strength, because it literally makes him feel like he's holding his worldview in his hand, which to him it feels like superior, and he feels that all should see it, so people would stop laughing at this person's jokes because they should see the superiority of what he's saying, of what O'Reilly's saying, of where it comes from. And the fact that O'Reilly is a directive G-mojo, you know, it's like he's wagging your bad code of conduct in your face. Colbert is doing it as a joke. And since he's not actually doing that, and more importantly, since he doesn't get momentum from doing that, his parody will go as far as he consciously understands the process and thus can mock it, which is actually quite high. He's an expert, but he's not a Vaigi, and thus his body will not move as such, but instead with that collapsible wrist and the finger not going up quite as high or out as far. If he actually followed the rigidity of the wrist and come out as high or as far as O'Reilly does, it might actually shut down his momentum because he needs to be loose. There's a connection between the cognitive processes and the physiological cues. It's very difficult to remain hidden because to remain hidden, you would have to give no sign of your momentum, which means that you can't really use it hardly at all. For Naiji, for example, who are the best at shape-shifting, they can't even do this completely. It's impossible, and it'll be fatiguing. You'll fatigue, and Naiji can take it to a fanatic level where they'll literally just exhaust themselves attempting to give no inkling of doing something different than the character. But even them will not be giving out those right cues at a subtle level. You know, they'll begin to get tired, and so there's no way for them to accomplish that completely. So with Colbert, there's a limit to his parody because his Ni and Zai would literally shut down trying to approximate that gesturing. To do that would require so much Vi and Ji that he would need to be a Vaigi to get momentum out of doing it, and he simply cannot. And this works with any comedian who likes to do parodies, like Tina Fey parodying Sarah Palin. She needs to keep up and approximate as best she can to keep the joke going, and if she keeps going and approximates to a certain point where she is actually like Sarah Palin, then it wouldn't be a joke anymore. She'd actually be literally possessed by Sarah Palin. Scary thought. Another access point, this is high level, it's subtle but it's there, is on the base knuckles of the finger. There's an axis point with the fingers. So here, fingers. With the fingers being above it, you can think of it like mini spines. And so you'll see again that on that plane that directives, when they move, the viscosity in the air does not make their fingers wiggle. With adaptives, like myself, there is bobble or shimmy, depending on whether that adaptive mojo is using Ni or V. But they move, when they move their fingers, when we move our fingers, it naturally kind of swivels in a kind of free-form way around the base knuckle. It's a very subtle thing, but if you get your eyes to see it, by watching, for example, Stephen Colbert and Bill O'Reilly, because they have the same powers, just one is adaptive, Stephen Colbert, and one is directive, Bill O'Reilly, you'll see that difference. Even as O'Reilly pulls the tool use gesture back, and with an adaptive there would be a tendency to collapse the wrist, to collapse the elbow. You'll see that he just holds the position there like resting the barrel of a gun on one's shoulder. As if taking, you know, game-playing cards that are directive game-playing cards and holding it in as he looks for the best opportunity to play those. It's a very Zai-heavy motif for a directive mojo, but he's playing the hunter, and it's as if he has the blade hidden under his shirt. His energy is keeping that tool in his hand. It's a directive stealth technique where he's trying to hide that he's on the kill with Colbert. He's acting like it's, you know, all civil, but that's a Jess Hunter who's on the kill. But since he hasn't seen the opportunity yet, or it's not appropriate to do so yet, he's holding his blade, his gun, his card. So it goes from jabbing, doing the finger pointing, accusation, to having it back there and ready to strike. But even when it's there and ready to strike, the tension is still there in his hand, even when it's back, because the strike is momentum for a Jazz Hunter, and that's what's needed to do what he really wants to be doing. Next we have Nijai Russell Brand in his interview on Conan O'Brien. So notice that Russell has his hands on the couch or on the chair armrests, which you see a lot of people do in their interviews. But there's a difference between what you'll see in adaptives doing that versus directives doing that same movement. The difference is that with Russell is that he has a lack of power arc all around, but one couple of things in particular is in the shoulder, and you'll see this with other adaptives like Jim Parsons, like Robert Downey Jr., like Adimas, like any of the adaptives, is that the arm is placed on the armrest or on the chair, and it's not so much pressing into the chair or driving into the chair, it's sort of just resting there. So generally directives hold their hands down or press it into the armrest or claw the armrest, whereas Russell, you'll see him at 52 seconds, for example, he has his hand on the armrest, but he's pulled his shoulder to such that there's a slackness of tension between the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and the fingers. And this comes from a natural adaptive momentum, which is to adapt to the environment and not hold tension. So adaptives will tend to place their limbs on the surface, or even lift off from it, you'll see that, or move it around it like a jungle gym, particularly the objective adaptives. But what you won't see so much is a pressing into that surface as if they're controlling it, as if they're using it as a perch, which you'll see with directive mojos. Directive mojos will have a tension on it like they're holding on a perch. They do that even when they're in that position of interlacing, that yin position of interlacing the fingers that we saw earlier. They'll put pressure into it as if they're going to use a tool to support themselves in some way, which is interesting that you'll notice a lot of time adaptives, when they lift themselves off of a chair, it almost has this floating quality to it. Directives look like they are pressing themselves up, like a gymnast pressing themselves up. But with for example, subjective adaptives, there's a fleeting quality, a floating quality to it, and with all adaptives and with the objective adaptives like Russell Brand, it looks more like they're playing on a tree or in a jungle gym rather than being in a captain's chair or some kind of power interface with the environment. Directives tend to hold themselves as if or hold on to the surface as if it's an interface or a railing in their work area or something to that effect, even when they're being casual, whereas the adaptive mojas will have a more playful use of it. One thing to note, besides the extension into the common area or up into the air, is that we've talked about before, is the extension into objects. Adaptives tend to rest more on objects because there's an axis point, just like there is with anything else, and there's an axis point of contact with the surface, and so there's a reluctance to jut, to drive into that object by an adaptive. Directives, on the other hand, will tend to have more of a comfortability with actually pressing and driving into the object. It's actually comforting. Just as it's comforting to hold the gestures above the head or into the common space. It's comforting to press into that armrest. The adaptives don't do this. And it's interesting, you'll see that Russell is actually swaying his body as he holds on to the armrest, purposefully not to have tension happen in his body. You'll see that he could actually move his body to where there would be tension. That would easily happen, but he doesn't. And when his hand does get tensioned on, he'll move his hand or move his body so as to not be in tension. The other lack of power arc that you'll see with him will be in the wrist. So you'll see sort of a smooth power arc, and I'll approximate it, but a smooth power arc with directives. But with adaptives, you'll see sort of a humped arc, sort of like the back of a camel. Even though Russell is holding on to something, he's not holding tension, and the angle of the hand means that he can't bear down into the chair because there's no power arc there, and so he's resting his hand as opposed to bearing down on it. You see that it also come up in his gesture, like when he's pointing, there's a hump in his wrist that will be difficult for directives to do. For example, in karate, you're told to make a line from, again, from your hand to your elbow, to your shoulder, to your hip, to your knee, to your supporting leg. And directives naturally do this because they want to project and to push into things. So his wrist is actually giving, and you'll see this in that there's what we call the collapsible wrist, which is when your wrist goes backward, it collapses, sort of just hinges back there, and even when it goes forward, there's sort of this hump wrist quality. Even when you're doing this, it's sort of there's a hump wrist. So there's a collapsible wrist when going backward, but also even when going forward, there's a looseness of tension that creates more viscosity in moving through the environment, through the air, and just like the hands give, or the fingers give in the viscosity, the hand wobbles. So even when the hand's still, there's a hump that isn't there with a power arc naturally. And there's a wobble point at the wrist and at the knuckle of the fingers. There's also another axis point, which we talk about is the axis point of the finger, as if you point it, and we talked about this and treat the finger like a mini spine and how it juggles. There's also another point when the hand is facing forward and you have the fingers pointing out, going out in a 90-degree angle, which is kind of an axis line to, you know, like if you're going out like this, which is sort of an axis line to common space and private space. And one thing that you'll notice, it's like a microcosm. When adaptives do the directive gesturing, they don't tend to come out as far, their hands don't go out as far, and there's also a flicking out of the fingers. It's almost like a flooding of birds when adaptives do this, you know, kind of out in this common space kind of movement. And it's because of two things. One is they dip their fingers in more aimed at the body, and when they bring their fingers out, there's a reluctance to cross the common space and go past the 90-degree mark, so it goes in towards the body, even touching the base of their own palms. So it'll go in here, so like that, or even coming in here and actually touching the base of the palms, which is very yin. It's a total collapsing of that power arc, where you actually curl in the power in your fingers. Directives tend to, and you'll see this with Grace Randolph in her interview, they tend to have their gesturing starts at 90 degrees and frequently flexes out and comes back. When it comes back, it often doesn't go past the 90-degree angle inward. It doesn't go inward like this past the 90-degree angle. Directives tend to, and you'll see this with Grace Randolph in her interview, they tend to have their yin gesturing start at 90-degree angle, and it frequently flexes out, and when it comes back, it often doesn't go past the 90-degree angle inward. It often stays here. It's one of those things that aids with the percussive quality of the directive gesturing. But with the adaptives, the fingers go more in. They're looser, they don't tend to go past the 90-degree angle and flex out, so it almost looks like fluttering bird wings again. The swatting of the air, there's this collapsible wrist. It's not going past the 90-degree angle and not really going into the common area. Even directives who are using yin gesturing, there's a rigidity and there's a power arc in the yin. Why? Because it hits harder. At 1:16, Conan, who's an Izai himself, is doing some of his own claw action, and you see when he does it, there's a classic wrist hump, and you're also going to see that there's this arc. He's doing a straight arc with his fingers, and it's really accentuated here because it's actually something that you'll often see with the towers, particularly with Spider of Zai and Franzi of Zhai. A depression of the fingers everywhere except the power. So instead of actually having an arc that makes power from the base knuckle to the tip of the finger, there's actually a collapsing of the wrist joint. There's a collapsing of the middle finger joint, and Conan has it. His wrist is collapsed in a hump wrist, and his individual fingers look like they're collapsed underneath the top part of the finger. Only the top part is sort of at a power arc position. The rest is already pre-collapsed. So if you were to press into the tips of the fingers. The rest of the fingers, the middle knuckle that holds most of the structural integrity of the fingers, it's actually not prepared to sustain load, and so it would collapse. And you'll see that a lot with the Franzi and spidery gesturing. Franzi gesturing, like myself, we'll do it a lot because we're the least inclined to do articulation, and so it's kind of like we're jutting and we're attempting to do the power arc with our hands, but there's a reluctance to do so because articulation is not part of momentum. So you'll see that collapsing of the arc even when you're going out into a yang, forward gesture. At that same time code of a minute 16, look at what Russell Brand is doing. He's actually levitating from the chair. He has his hands on the armrest and he's levitating. And actually notice that the flesh in his hands and fingers as he's levitating up. It's actually not the flesh of his hands and his fingers are actually not depressed into the sofa cushion and not grasping inward for a full claw, despite him being able to support his weight. Even supporting his weight, he has that reduced articulation depression or projection. The projection points are as few as possible, so again it looks like he's floating, like he's spider walking on water, which is a look that adaptives will have in their gesturing. Directives tend to clasp from the beginning and sort of press, again, much like a gymnast pressing off of a bar. It looks cool and feral, but it doesn't have that floaty quality that the adaptive gesturing would. Adaptive movement, like the Franzi movement or the spider movement, is at all times prepared to pull back, even when it's going forward. When the movement's going forward, all of the main momentum energy is in preparation to retower or to regain equilibrium. So it's looking. There's this looking to retower, even as objective adaptives like Russell are doing their gesturing, because being at equilibrium, being in the tower, is a momentum power even for the objective adaptives. It's an attempt to maintain equilibrium while flying. At 2 minutes 14, you'll see Russell Brand does a jiggling hand movement. There's something that adaptives have with it, which is that jiggle, that bobble in the wrists and fingers, which we mentioned, and that is what increases the viscosity as they move their hand through the air. Their viscosity and pressure makes the wrists and fingers jiggle because they're naturally adaptive, almost in a bobbly way when using knee. And both Russell and Conan will do this, have that bobble. They'll both take their hands up in the air and shake them in a very kind of yang way, but the movements are jiggling the whole time. So look for Demas to do this as well, and it's just awesome. But see here, two knee mojos doing yang finger pointing with lots of jiggle wrists, jiggle fingers. At 3:45, Russell gets very excited and does a lot of pointing and jabbing gestures, very yang gestures, and you'll see that the rigidity for him when he's doing these gets quite high for him. He's actually doing a lot of jabbing, but it's jiggling the whole time. Jiggling in the shoulders, jiggling in the wrists, jiggling in the fingers. Notice that when he does the finger jabbing forward, and you'll see this with a Demas or any other adaptive, there is also this axis point of the wrists, so that when going forward, the palm of the hand is sort of at a 90-degree angle with the floor. Adaptives naturally want to, or directives naturally want to go at least 90 degrees and extend over 9 degrees. The collapsible movement for the adaptives also happens when they move forward, in that they also tend to have their palm at 90 degrees to the floor naturally, and it actually wants to go backward, which actually yins that forward protruding finger. So you have the pointing finger jabbing out, but the actual supporting knuckle is swayed back, almost like jutting, where you're jutting, but you're doing it from a tower position. That looks a little bit like a chicken. So you're jutting something forward, but the main axis is actually pulled back. So here the main axis is at the wrist, is actually pulled back and is jabbing. When a directive tries to do that, it takes tension to actually put their hand into that. But for an adaptive, their hand just naturally does this this backward movement. It's sort of a desire, you know, to collapse into itself. It goes into this this kickstand position, and it's very natural for adaptives. At 427, notice as Russell's hand brushes up against his legs or passes over his legs, and this would apply to any kind of surface, but the point is, as the hand passes over the object, he's not thinking about it, and so the natural lack of tensioning makes for floppiness as the hand passes over, and that's just part of being adaptive. It's allowing his hand to not get hurt, you know, because it just sort of kind of collapses and adapts and goes through in a floppy sort of way. Directives, they skate and press across the leg, even if they skim, and often you'll notice, you know, if they bump their leg, there'll actually be a bump off. So like when you hit something and you bump off, like, you know, when you're hitting something taut, it will bounce and it will actually skate off, as opposed to when something is loose and you hit it, then it'll kind of go squishy. So as his hand impacts his leg, it kind of goes floppy hand across it, whereas directives will tend to, you know, if it's in a clumsy sort of fashion, if they hit the leg, you know, they'll bump off, or if they're masterful, they'll actually hit and then sort of trace around it in the way that their hands move where they want them to go, because they're structured. So if you look at how close Russell's hands are to his legs, there's actually a lot of hand hitting there when he did the gesturing or the movement. For that much hand hitting that went on, there was actually, it created a very little drag, and it didn't pop up at all when this happened. For the directives, the hitting of objects, a lot of times will jar them into their directive ways, because directives, they don't like surprises. It bothers them when their hand absent-mindedly hits or touches things. When Russell's hands hit the armrest and his leg, or a few other things throughout the interview, he's not aware of it, which means they're actually surprising him. And adaptives are much cooler with environmental surprises than directives are. And up next, let's take a look at the gesturings of Ziny Elizabeth Olsen in her Scott Feinberg interview. For some fine shadings, you can compare and contrast the gesturings between objective adaptives and subjective adaptives. One thing, for example, is the floppiness as opposed to the pull-backedness. Subjective adaptives tend to have more emphasis on the pull-backedness, meaning keeping the arms close to the body, the collapsedness of the wrists, the pulling things backward over the axis lines. The fingers kind of have that long extended spider walking on water kind of quality. Whereas the objective adaptive mojos, both Ni and V users, tend to have more of the quicker moving hand. You'll see more floppiness, more of a flopping around with the hand with the increased movement. There's increased movement, but also more floppiness in the digits. With the subjective adaptives, there's a slower moving kind of pace with the gesturing, with more accentuation with the pulling back of energy, with reclining energy being very natural. So you'll see Elizabeth here, and you can compare it to Nizai, both male and female, and you'll see the similarities. The cool Gumby claw that Nizai have and the spider gesture that Zaini have are in the same gesture family, but the cool Gumby claw is faster. There's more movement, but with more floppiness. With Elizabeth, you'll notice that there is less floppiness, but you'll see more spidery, more depressing of the palms, the humpback in the wrist, the elongation of the finger, sway back. So sway back, so coming behind the axis of the hand. You saw Conan doing it, you know, the sway back when he was doing that gesturing that we froze on. Her fingers sway back in most of her gesturing, which gives her that spider looking gesturing quality. And you'll see that comparing, for example, again with Nizai to Zaini, there'll be a similar comparison. Franzi has the same family relationship with warm Gumby claw of the Nizai, except, you know, to the Franzi gesturing of the Zaini, and with the warm Gumby claw, because it's using Ni first, and there is more bobbling. There's also, it's objective, there's quicker movement, and it's faster with more floppiness. And there's more floppiness around the bobbling of the finger digits. Just like we've talked about, you know, the sway to bobble ratio, overall, you'll see that in the individual fingers and in the wrists. So there's more swaying of the wrists, swaying of the wrists with the Zaini, like myself, for example, and with the Nizai, there's more of a carriage bobble. There's more of a digit bobble. There's more of a rich wrist flopping around and fingers flopping around, similar to the time signature of the bobble and the carriage. The time signature of the hand of the Zaini Franzi is almost like a miniature of the entire Zaini body. So you can almost see the lines of the Zaini like a puppet. You can almost put a little nice puppet on top of it and have a little Zaini puppet, and the Franzi hand would make a nice little puppet hand for that, just like the warm Gumby claw would for a Nizai. The entire arm, the entire hand, the entire finger are each like little miniature spines that follow along with all the rest. So for gesturing, it's interesting that there are axes in all of these components, and that directive and adaptive momentum can be seen in all of them. At a minute 3, when Elizabeth puts her hands in her hair, notice how the wrist, as she passes from the front of her face backwards in motion, that there's a natural wrist collapse, and you can see that in counterpoint to Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Jennifer Lopez in the hair adjusting maneuver, is that for the directives there's a tensioning in the wrist while doing that, but when Elizabeth is doing it, it actually collapses as she takes her hand gesturing over her ear. And it's interesting to note that although she's pulling her hand inward, so you would think it's a natively yin thing, actually there's, you know, it's naturally yang, you know, the part of our, it's sort of like articulating when you're doing that adjusting of the hair, structuring her outfit or structuring her hair, but she doesn't do that full tensioning energy. You know, she's not positioning things into place. It's more of a flowing, collapsing sort of movement. And so tensioning would be more appropriate if you're actually trying to position things in the hair gesturing. But this is different. What she's doing is different, and there's the collapsing of the wrist because she is adaptive. Tensioning again would be more appropriate if she wanted to place her hairs exactly, particularly if the Modro has Vi, and she does have Vi and G, but those are modulation for her. Meticulous appearance is a classic with Vi and G. So she's doing that to a certain extent, but she's actually in her Zai and Ni with the head tilt. So she's in her momentum, and she doesn't have much tensioning in the fingers or the wrist because really she's not really adjusting her hair. It's more of an adaptive fidget. And so these little things come out, you know, when you're adjusting your dress, adjusting your pants, adjusting your seat in the chair, adjusting your hair. These things will just give you away because they're done so often throughout being present in the environment that you'll see, you can't help but see that the directives, or I mean that the adaptives are freeform, and so adjusting their outfits often has a fidgeting quality to it, whereas directives, even when they're fidgeting, the fidgeting looks like they're adjusting their clothes, like they're adjusting their hair. For example, when she moves her hand through her hair, and you'll see this with Ademus, with myself and other adaptives, at times it's not quite clear what it is, what it is that we're doing, but with directives, generally when they do things like Jennifer Lopez, who actually has the same powers as Elizabeth, just in different ranking, it's in a polar ranking. When she touches her hair, the tensioning and the gesturing is on throughout. With Elizabeth, it's just not important to close out what the gesturing is. When directives are doing yin gesturing, there can be almost a need to close out the gesture, like I just yinned here, didn't you see my yin? That means that I'm adapting. So it's different for directives and adaptives. At 1:10, Elizabeth does a smack away, and because she extends it away from her body, that's coming out of the tower, which makes it a yang gesture. So when you go out from the body, you're going to move the air, and there's usually a power arc from the wrist to the palm to the fingers, and that actually slices through the air, and you swat back and forth. But when she does it, it's loose. There's a looseness to it. Again, the hump wrist, the slightly depressed palms, the pulled back finger digits, and so she does the swing, and you'll see this again with Ademus and myself, who are both Nez Towers. There's an impressionistic quality to it. There's actually an outward swatting gesture that's, this is actually a swatting gesture that's very yang, but that's soft curvature out of the power arc, a non-power arc curvature in the wrist, and the palms and the fingers yins up that gesture and makes it look altered state. It's actually swatting of the air while giving in to the viscosity. That's an adaptive Modro doing altered state yang, because they're actually doing a gesture designed to cut through viscosity while not having the tensioning in their wrists, palms, and fingers that would cut through that viscosity. She does also does a backhand fist. But when she does it, there's a looseness in the palm tension and the finger tension that doesn't make it a rigid back fisting implement of any kind. And in the backhanding motion, you know, it also doesn't stay in a power arc. It actually does collapsing outward. She does a yang gesturing that's designed to hit the environment, but it kind of, you know, it sort of flops into place. Directives tend to do these gestures, like, you know, the back of the knuckles into the air, and when they do it, though, that it generally has energy that looks almost as if they're tapping against the glass or a door. You know, like there's this percussive quality to it, but Elizabeth has a wrist collapse, and that's at 1 minute and 47 seconds. And she follows it directly into another stroking of the hair. Again, she has that wrist collapse while doing that hair stroke. At 2 minutes, around 2 minutes 10, she has a splaying of the fingers, but you'll notice that they're not jabbing and they don't look like they're being popped and positioned out there. They're sort of dangling as she spools out her stream of consciousness thoughts. So something else that you'll notice as well is that oftentimes there's more uniformity to the way that the fingers are placed, and that's actually part of the power arc. The power arc is into the wrist, into the palms, also in the grouping of the fingers together for some sort of aim, either making a fist or making a claw or pointing a finger or holding an instrument. Whereas you'll notice here, you know, the jiggling effect. If you see Ademus really getting into the stream of consciousness as he rotates his fingers and he spools his hands, his fingers almost look like they're in water. They sort of just float wherever. They have no structural tension to them. It's very beautiful. Again, you'll notice when she does the back of the hands, flicking her hand into the environment, that there's a tendency that in counterpoint to when directives do that, or when they're doing a combination of yin and yang projective arm, like the yin hand held in position, the palms up to the ceiling, that the directives have more of a tendency to have the fingers out and the tips pointed in that jabbing position that we saw with Grace Randolph, for example, or others. Whereas hers, they sort of, when they come out, they sort of have this spindly, spidery quality. But often it is at this time that the fingers stay pointed towards the palms, so inward. The fingers don't want to point out. The fingers are reluctant to go past that 90-degree angle. So even though she's flicking, there's you know, so there's there's energy to take the fingers forward and outward. Her fingers don't. They stay in sort of this collapsed position. So we talked about the collapsing of the wrists, and there's also the collapsing of the finger digits. They don't pop out. The adaptive's fingers don't pop out like the directives do. And you see this at, for example, at 2 minutes, 32 seconds. Now let's take a look at Nijrei Regina Spektor in the buzzworthy interview. So Regina does a move that adaptives will do, which is brushing their fingers against the other hand's fingers, and when she does, there's kind of this give, kind of like young bamboos, like reeds giving way. The Gumby Claw that you'll see, her not, you know, when she's doing that Gumby Claw movement, there is a gumbiness, a flexation, a looseness of this claw tension or movement. So at 37 seconds, she starts doing this Yin Gumby Claw. So you actually see that Gumby clawing in the air, and again there's that looseness in the wrists as she does it, and you can almost see the bobble in the wrists and the fingers. And this kind of relates to the depressed palm plus the pullback, which is that when Regina or other objective perceivers are doing that Gumby claw, or Nialphas are doing the Gumby claw, there's generally more of a rounding forward over the axis point, which gives it a power arc with the individual fingers. If this was being done by a directive, if the directive was doing a claw gesturing, it would have more of a power arc from the wrists into the palms into the individual fingers, kind of like talons. But you'll see with adaptives, you know, as Regina is clawing, she actually has the knuckles going backward behind the axis line. So it wants to freeform because that's actually momentum. So it's a natural tendency for directives to use power arcs in their arms, power arcs in their wrists, power arc in the curvature of their palm, power arcs in the fingers. But adaptives do it in reverse. There's a collapsing of the shoulder, a collapsing of the wrists, a collapsing of the palms, a collapsing of the fingers. You'll also notice with Regina's movements that there's a viscosity, and that she goes and does these roundabout Gumby claw movements, and it flows around the energy of the environment. The way you see, again, birds' wings buffet as they go through the air and are hitting wind currents, you'll see their limbs adjust and relax into it. So they sort of let it happen as their wings move. The hands of adaptives do that in the viscosity of the environment. As they carry through this viscosity, you know, they'll freeform and adapt and relax into it and flow into it. And it's something that directives don't have. Directives will cut through the viscosity, but for adaptives, their hands will wobble or will flutter. And when Regina is doing the yin backhand into the environment, usually you have the back of the top two joints of the fingers. That's what's hitting the air, as opposed, you know, to for example Grace Randolph and others, where there's the jabbing of the fingers out. With the backhand, there's usually this percussiveness and jabbing, you know, sort of like percussive jab, percussive jab, percussive jab. But, you know, this would be natural for directives. But with Regina, there's a collapsing of the wrist, and the fingers don't come out and jab. So it's more of this kind of thing. Next, let's talk about Vijay Cameron Diaz in her Lopez Tonight interview. So Cameron's doing yin adaptive gesturing of resting her one arm on the other, sort of, and placing both her hands on one leg, which is sort of a playful adaptive yin move. And you can compare her gesturings to Nijai Regina Spektor. They're both objective jazz perceivers, but Regina has ni instead of V, like Cameron has it. So for Cameron, there'll be more of a crisp visceralness to the motion, but there you'll still see wobbling of the wrists and fingers, a gooseneck in the wrist, a depression in the palms, the fingers that go backward over the palm axis line, a high viscosity in the movements, the splayed fingers that just naturally flow that way, and so forth. So you can see that there's a little bit of difference, but those adaptive traits, the adaptive traits of a jazz gatherer, are all there. And next, let's take a look at Jaini Melina Kanakaridis and her Craig Ferguson 2008 interview. So as Melina comes out to hug Craig Ferguson, she extends her arms in a straight line. But it doesn't have that stabbing or puncturing forward into the environment that a directive would in their gesturing. It's more like a resting in the air. And then when she comes in for the hug, she collapses her shoulders, her elbows, and does a gooseneck with her wrists. So you'll see that, and that's different than how a directive would do it. And so then you'll see when she's seated, her hands are resting on her leg, but they're sort of flopping unawarely, as opposed to being positioned there, like we talked about with David Beckham, for example, or any of the other directives. She has yin wavy swaying lines in her movement, and also as an opposition to the power arc, she has waviness in her wrists, in her palms, and in her fingers. There are multiple collapse points. Melina also does that fast patter in yin gesturing, fast patter. And when she does, the fingers kind of move independently, like her fingers are doing free-form, free-for-all. Notice when she does the double pointing up at 2 minutes 52 seconds. When she does it, she has a collapsed wrist. It doesn't go in that power arc that would be able to sustain load. It's collapsed. Ademus does that as well as a Zaini. So because this is very much a tower movement. The wobbliness is more with objective perception, and the recliningness or the pulling back over the axis line is heavily associated with the towers. So when she's doing her pointing, she actually has her wrists pulled back and inward as she's pointing upward. Melina's hand movements always look like petals of a flower unfurling. So the energy is in the back of the hands pressing the viscosity down, as opposed to popping out and jabbing into the viscosity, which almost all directives do when doing the same sort of gesturing. So they'll do this and jab, as opposed to the unfurling. So the directives will do the percussive to pop and then jabbing out into the environment. For Melina, instead of a jabbing percussive, it's almost like a petting with the back of the hands, and you can see this at 4 minutes 19 seconds, for example. There's an axis point with the wrist and with the palm, and we mentioned, how the fingers have a reluctancy to go out and do the flipping motion past that 90-degree angle and out into the environment. For adaptives, they tend to stay inward and closer to the hands. That's also part of the overall palm. When directives do the same back of the hands, as we said, to the environment, the arm projects out further, but so does, and we've talked about this, the fingers flex out and jab in, the back of the hand flexes. It's interesting because you'll notice that the adaptives have a tendency to do this when it's in a yin way. If collapsing that way would be more yin, they tend to do that. But notice when it goes to the patting of the backs of the hand to the environment, they actually do the reverse. The wrist will collapse inward. So we talk about how they have a tendency of collapsing and collapsing backward, but in this case it's the palm inward, so she's doing some patting, but adaptives don't tip over that axis line. This is something that for directives they'll have to think about hard to do it. The adaptives will shoot their wrists out when doing this patting, but they'll curl everything inward. Now let's talk about Nizai Kristen Bell and her David Letterman 2010 interview. Notice when Kristen comes in that her arms swing at her side. As she does, you can actually see a slight bobble, jiggle in the wrists and fingers as her arms swing side to side. With Kristen Bell, you can see the adaptive gesturing that we've already covered, and one thing that might help you hone in on that is to pay particular attention to the way she does her specific adaptiveness in relation to Elizabeth Olsen, because you can really see the parallels between an objective and a subjective version of using those same two top powers of Ni and Zai. Kristen Bell is doing the cool Gumby Claw as compared to the spider gesturing that Elizabeth Olsen is doing, and you know, that spider gesturing is simply the subjective counterpart to the objective cool Gumby Claw. But then also compare, besides Elizabeth Olsen, compare the gesturing of Kristen Bell to the warm Gumby Claw of Regina Spektor, and you can actually see that they both share the quicker movements, that the Kristen Bell will share the quicker movements with Regina Spektor. There's more jiggliness in the wrists and in the fingers of Ni Alpha, and they'll both share that. But then you'll again notice how she splays her fingers. It's more of a spidery-like splaying of fingers, and that's because she's an adaptive cerebral, but so that element will be more reminiscent again to Elizabeth Olsen, except it won't be as spindly and spidery as Elizabeth Olsen's. It will be instead quicker and tighter. It will be tighter in energy in the hand, and there'll be more quickness and more jiggly movements to it. At 3 minutes 46 seconds, Kristen does a fist boxy motion, like speed back boxing motion. When she does it, notice the lack of the power angle in the wrist. Makes it look like she's doing the maracas instead of actually, you know, punching a speed bag. Other times, you know, and she looks like she's doing a combination. It looks like she's almost like taking a fistful of a blanket and adjusting it over your shoulders as you would a shawl, like this. Lady Gaga and Cat Power do this kind of movements. All adaptives do it, where their knuckles are actually more outward, and when they're, you know, so they can do this one, looks like the maracas, or when the knuckles are more facing each other, or more, you know, facing one another, or like more inward, like Kristen's doing here. It looks more like you're bringing a blankie in and you're sort of nuzzling. Next up, Vizai Victoria Beckham and her CNN Talk Asia interview. So with Victoria, you have the same type of gesturing that you'll see with other adaptives. You see that collapsing of the wrists, the going back behind the midline of the wrist with the movement, and the jiggle in the fingers and the wrist, but you'll notice some slight different aspects with Victoria Beckham being a Vizai. So see if you can train your eyes to see these similarities that these nuanced similarities and differences that she has with other adaptives. So for example, with Kristen Bell, in that both of them are objective perceivers with Zai as tandem, and so there's similarities in the four fingers and the way that they move it, and you'll see that also with the Zai Ni. You know, the Zai Ni will have that similarity of the spindly, spidery movement, and also the Vizai. There's also, though, a crispness to the movements coming from the V, and that's going to be more reminiscent to Vijay Cameron Diaz. So you can see all these variations of adaptive gesturing, and they share these common aspects that we've talked about before that all adaptive gesturing does. So at this point, it helps to accentuate what adaptedness is, or adaptive yin and yang gesturing, but also see if you can tell the difference between what Cameron Diaz is doing and what Victoria Beckham is doing, or between what Victoria Beckham is doing and what Kristen Bell is doing. So by doing the compare and contrast, you'll be accentuating the difference between the adaptives, which in turn highlights the adaptiveness in them to your Aizen training. And next we have Jaini Tom Hanks in his Jonathan Ross 2008 interview. So you'll see in the beginning of the interview when he's turning back to the singers, to the backup singers, Tom's using the back of the couch to rest his arm as he's pointing back behind him. So notice that the arm doesn't have that power arc to it. It's sort of just resting there. Doesn't have the tension or the power arc coming from the shoulder on down. And with that gesturing and other gesturings of Tom Hanks, you'll see movements and gesturings akin to Jaini Melina Kanakaridis, which we've looked at a little bit before, but with more tension because this is a male version, as Jaini male. And you'll also see some similarities with Nijai Russell Brand, but Tom Hanks will have more towery, frenzy movement, slower movement. And you'll also see some similarities with Zaini Jeff Goldblum. But with Tom Hanks, you'll see more frenzy, willowy movement as opposed to cool, spidery movement. So next up, there's a quiz coming out that will be testing the skills that you've gained in being able to tell yin versus yang gesturing, and we also have some additional cue spotlights that will be highlighting some different cues for you to be able to distinguish the difference between two types of mojos. And so take a look at those. So the next step for you in your learning process though is to take that quiz and really test out your ability to see that yang versus yin gesturing. Learning to mojo read will show you the truth of who you really are. Learning about your peak pathway and social alchemy will give you the energy that you need for every part of your life. And helping Podlair to save the world will give you the heroic purpose for the gift that you've been given. So know yourself, grow yourself, save the world.